Have you ever felt that something was missing from a story you've heard your whole life? For generations, countless believers have read the Gospels convinced they've seen the full picture of Jesus' life. From the angelic birth in Bethlehem to his final breath on the cross in Jerusalem, the story seems complete. But what if I told you that more than half of his life is hidden, unaccounted for in the shadows of time? Between the age of 12, when he astonished the temple scholars with his insight, and the moment he re-emerges around 30 to be baptized in the Jordan River, there exists a deafening silence. Nearly 2 decades of his life, 18 years, vanish without a single recorded event. No letters, no stories, no witnesses, nothing. Where did he go? What happened to the child prodigy who would one day redefine human history and spiritual consciousness? How does someone vanish from historical records, only to return as a wise teacher whose words still echo across centuries? This isn't just a curious omission. This is over 60% of his life before his public ministry, completely unaccounted for. Imagine reading a book where the middle chapters were torn out, yet everyone pretends the story still makes sense. That's the unsettling reality we face when examining the life of Jesus. Does this realization stir something within you? If so, don't ignore it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Could the untold years of Jesus contain truths deeper than we were taught? Subscribe and turn on notifications if you're ready to explore the forgotten truths most avoid discussing. Share this with friends and family who are searching for more than surface-level answers. Because sometimes we have to unlearn what we thought we knew to finally see clearly. Some might argue that nothing important happened during those years. Others claim there was simply nothing worth recording. But can we honestly believe that nearly 2 decades of the life of the most influential spiritual figure in human history left no mark, no moment worth remembering? Or was something deliberately left out? Perhaps what was omitted wasn't forgotten. It was concealed, not because it didn't exist, but because it was inconvenient. Today, we're opening a door many have avoided for centuries. What lies behind it could shake long-held assumptions. Whether you see it as heresy or hidden truth, that's up to you. But you owe it to yourself to look. Be ready. What you're about to uncover might transform how you see Jesus forever. Open any gospel, and one scene stands out with breathtaking clarity. A 12-year-old boy, seated among the elders in the temple, speaking with wisdom that silenced even the learned teachers. The questions he asked, the clarity of his replies. Everything about that moment was extraordinary. It felt like the beginning of a spiritual journey that would be meticulously recorded. And yet, right after this astonishing event, the narrative goes silent. There's no transition. The next time he appears, he's an adult standing beside the Jordan River, baptized, prepared, powerful. But what happened in between? Where are the testimonies from family members, friends, or even critics during those missing years? Why is there not a single verse describing those formative moments? The absence is too great to be accidental. It feels more like something, or someone, wanted that chapter of his life to remain in the dark. Isn't it odd that the central figure of a global faith would have his young adulthood completely erased from historical record? Consider this. When crafting the biography of any respected leader, we explore what shaped them, who mentored them, what they studied, where they struggled. These details matter. They help us understand how greatness is born. And yet with Jesus, we're given a glimpse of childhood, and suddenly a leap to adulthood, fully mature, completely centered, and teaching with an authority that mystified both crowds and scholars alike. Where did that depth come from? How did he develop such profound clarity? Some suggest he simply remained in Nazareth, living quietly as a carpenter's son. But even if that were true, does a secluded village life explain the universal truths he later shared? Or is it possible that those 18 years weren't empty at all, but instead filled with experiences the world was never meant to know? How can one explain his remarkable ability to speak in parables? How did he command such deep spiritual insight, master language with poetic clarity, and express wisdom that echoed teachings far beyond his cultural context? Concepts such as inner light, detachment, boundless compassion, and universal love weren't central in the Judaism of his era. Yet Jesus not only understood them, he embodied them. This glaring gap has driven many researchers and spiritual thinkers to ask a bold question. What if Jesus didn't simply remain in Galilee during his missing years? What if he journeyed to distant lands, studying with sages and absorbing ancient wisdom that would later shape his divine message? The absence of documentation isn't proof that nothing occurred. It may be proof that someone chose silence. And that silence raises an even deeper inquiry. What was so important, or perhaps so controversial, about those 18 years that they were left out entirely? This biographical void is more than a historical omission. It's an invitation, a challenge to seek out what others might have tried to conceal. Because understanding what happened between the ages of 12 and 30 could redefine not just who Jesus was, but the very nature of the message he brought to the world. For centuries, mystics, historians, and adventurers have wrestled with this mystery. Where did the young man from Nazareth disappear to for almost 2 decades? One theory, supported by intriguing patterns, circumstantial clues, and cultural echoes, suggests that Jesus may have ventured east, perhaps to India, perhaps to Persia, maybe even to the mountains of Tibet. In these regions, he could have encountered ancient philosophies, practiced spiritual disciplines, and embraced a worldview that transcended religious borders. At first glance, such a journey might seem implausible, but consider the context of the first century. The Mediterranean world wasn't isolated. Trade routes flourished, particularly the legendary Silk Road, which carried not only exotic goods but also philosophies, spiritual teachings, and ideas that flowed freely from east to west. These were not static times. Scholars, merchants, and seekers of truth often traversed great distances in pursuit of knowledge and enlightenment. This possibility isn't just a product of modern imagination. In the late 1800s, a Russian explorer named Nicholas Notovich claimed to have discovered ancient manuscripts in the Hemis monastery in Ladakh, nestled deep within the Tibetan Himalayas. According to these writings, a mysterious figure named Issa, a holy man from the West, had studied among Buddhist monks. This man was described as one who preached love, humility, and inner peace, values deeply aligned with Jesus' later teachings. Though Notovich's claims were met with skepticism, other spiritual figures like Swami Abhedananda and the philosopher Nicholas Roerich also reported discovering similar accounts during their travels. These parallel discoveries reignited curiosity and raised a provocative question: could Isa be Jesus? The name Isa is phonetically consistent with the Arabic form of Jesus, and the time frame of his appearance in the East curiously mirrors the years Jesus is missing from the biblical record. Again, we don't need definitive proof to ask meaningful questions. The presence of a compassionate foreign teacher in Eastern texts during the exact window of Jesus' undocumented life should at least raise eyebrows. Eastern oral traditions even speak of a foreign healer, one who emphasized inner divinity, practiced nonviolence, and used touch to bring relief and restoration. These vague yet resonant details echo the very essence of Jesus' mission. And while skeptics may dismiss the similarities as coincidence, the parallels are too striking to ignore. What's even more compelling is how certain themes in Jesus' teachings align with ancient Eastern thought. Consider his command to love not just your neighbor but also your enemy, a direct parallel to Buddhist ideals of universal compassion. His emphasis on humility, detachment from material wealth, and the pursuit of the kingdom within mirror doctrines found in Hindu and Buddhist traditions long before the first century. if we're willing to entertain the possibility that Jesus' teachings were shaped by more than just his Jewish roots, then perhaps his message becomes even more powerful, a divine voice that speaks across cultures, a teacher who drew from the wells of ancient wisdom to reveal something timeless and universal. When Jesus declared, "The kingdom of God is within you," it wasn't merely a poetic metaphor, it was a radical spiritual insight. One that resonates not with the dominant teachings of first-century Judea, but with ancient philosophies from distant lands. In the Vedic scriptures of India, the concept of Atman, the divine essence residing in every being, mirrors this statement with striking clarity. And in Eastern traditions like Taoism and Jainism, the core emphasis on humility, ego renunciation, and spiritual detachment parallels the very heart of Jesus' message. Could all these parallels be mere coincidences? Perhaps. But isn't it also plausible, perhaps even likely, that Jesus, in his formative years, was influenced by a tapestry of spiritual traditions far beyond his homeland? That he absorbed profound truths wherever he encountered them, reshaping them through a voice uniquely his own? The official narrative paints Jesus as a provincial carpenter's son, growing up in the small town of Nazareth with minimal exposure to the outside world. But how does one reconcile that with the sweeping spiritual authority he later displayed? How does someone with no recorded formal education command the language of mysticism, teach through universal metaphors, and articulate ethical visions that transcend time and culture? The canonical Gospels offer no answers to these questions. Between the ages of 12 and 30, the life of Jesus is a closed chapter, locked away in silence. But that silence isn't emptiness. It's an echo that invites deeper listening. We know that early Christianity included many voices. There were Gospels and manuscripts that presented alternative portraits of Jesus, many of which were later deemed apocryphal and excluded from the final biblical canon. These texts weren't discarded due to irrelevance, but likely because they didn't align with the theological and institutional framework the early church sought to establish. Acknowledging the possibility that Jesus may have encountered Eastern teachings doesn't diminish his greatness. It elevates it. It presents him not as a figure locked in one tradition, but as a seeker who transcended boundaries in pursuit of eternal truth. He becomes a bridge, not just between God and man, but between East and West, between cultures, between spiritual worlds. It's the image of a soul unconfined by borders, who absorbed wisdom from many wells and poured it into a single cup of revelation for his people. To explore these ideas is not to undermine faith, but to enrich it. It's not an act of rebellion against tradition, but a gesture of reverence toward the complexity of truth. If we are to truly know Jesus, not as an icon, but as a man, as a teacher, as a guide, we must be willing to consider everything that shaped him. His teachings were profoundly original, yet they carry notes familiar to the ears of those acquainted with the East. When we hear him say, "The kingdom is within," we also hear the Upanishadic whisper that the divine is not found in the external world, but in the sacred silence of the self. That knowledge, in its purest form, isn't found in books or rituals, but in the realization of the soul's unity with the source. Even his radical command to love one's enemies finds few roots in Jewish tradition, but resonates deeply with Buddhist teachings. The Dhammapada, an ancient compilation of the Buddha's sayings, proclaims, "Hatred is not overcome by hatred. Hatred is overcome by love. This is an eternal truth." That sentiment is nearly identical in spirit to Jesus' instruction to forgive endlessly, to offer the other cheek, to bless those who curse. His use of parables also invites a closer look. These were not simple stories. They were spiritual riddles, encoded truths hidden in the everyday. Much like Zen koans or the wisdom tales of ancient India, they demanded reflection, not reaction. They weren't lessons to memorize, they were experiences to be lived. All of this begs a sacred question. Could it be that Jesus' silence during those missing years was not absence but preparation, not void but pilgrimage, and that what he brought back wasn't borrowed doctrine but distilled truth, universally understood? The way Jesus taught was unlike anything seen among the rabbis of his time. Instead of rigid legal interpretation or formal theological argument, he favored stories, parables layered with symbols, designed to unlock deeper reflection within the soul. This method, though foreign to the Judean religious circles of the first century, was foundational in many Eastern traditions. Across Asia, storytelling wasn't merely a teaching tool, it was the path to wisdom. His emphasis on detachment from material possessions also stands out. It aligns not just with the prophets of Israel, but with a worldview deeply rooted in Eastern philosophy. In the Tao Te Ching, Laozi speaks of non-attachment, of letting go, of simplicity as a virtue. Jesus echoes this sentiment in the Sermon on the Mount, when he warns, "Do not store up treasures on earth, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." The resonance is undeniable. But it's not just what Jesus said, it's how he lived. His ascetic lifestyle mirrored that of spiritual seekers from India to China. He owned little, fasted often, retreated to the wilderness to pray, and cherished solitude. His connection to nature, his pursuit of inner stillness, and his devotion to personal transformation reveal a man whose life reflected the same path walked by monks, sages, and mystics of the East. He did not only preach about the kingdom of God, he embodied the journey toward it. There are linguistic clues as well. One example is his use of the term Son of Man, translated from the Aramaic Bar Nasha. While this has often been interpreted as a messianic title, some Central Asian texts also use it to describe an enlightened being, someone who embodies divine consciousness while remaining deeply human. His repeated reference to the way, as a metaphor for the spiritual journey, closely mirrors both the Tao, literally the way in Taoism, and the Buddhist Noble Eightfold Path, a framework for enlightenment. Could Jesus have encountered these ideas firsthand during years spent beyond Judea? Skeptics may argue that similar teachings can emerge in separate cultures through what is known as parallel development. That wisdom, like water, flows toward the same truths in every civilization. And while this is a possibility, we must also remember the ancient world was far more interconnected than we often assume. Trade routes, like the Silk Road, carried more than spices and fabrics. They transported philosophies, stories, and spiritual practices across continents. Intellectual hubs such as Alexandria in Egypt housed manuscripts from many traditions. There, seekers and scholars exchanged ideas in a melting pot of cultures and religions. For a spiritual mind as open and expansive as Jesus, such exposure would have been transformative. And if, as many theories suggest, he traveled through the East during his silent years, his message begins to make even more sense. Some contemporary scholars propose that Jesus was not merely a religious innovator, but a synthesizer, a master who gathered truths from various wells and distilled them into a message powerful enough to speak across ages. His wisdom may not have emerged from a vacuum, but from a profound encounter between East and West. Even his healing practices show echoes of Eastern traditions. Laying on of hands, the channeling of healing through faith, and the intention-focused miracles align with principles found in Ayurvedic healing, Reiki, and Qigong. Was this knowledge taught to him by masters abroad, or did he arrive at these truths through inner revelation that coincidentally mirrored ancient Eastern techniques? Another striking parallel lies in his idea of being born again. Oishu, while foreign to mainstream Jewish thought of the time, the concept of spiritual rebirth appears in Hindu initiations, Egyptian mystery schools, and various esoteric rites of the ancient world. Rebirth wasn't about physical transformation, but about awakening to the soul's divine essence. To suggest these connections isn't to strip Jesus of originality or divinity, it's to see him through a broader, deeper lens. It's to recognize that his greatness wasn't confined to preserving tradition, but in transcending it. He wasn't a man bound to one culture. He was a voice for the human spirit, shaped by the timeless truths of many paths. Understanding Jesus in this light doesn't reduce his power, it magnifies it. It shows us a teacher who didn't just preach a new religion, but who translated eternal wisdom into words and actions his people could understand, a bridge between ancient worlds. A timeless guide who walked the way, not just for Israel, but for all humanity. Perhaps this is why his message endures, not because it was rooted in exclusivity, but because it spoke to something universal. And recognizing that doesn't weaken faith, it deepens it. It doesn't displace Jesus from the center of the story. It reveals how far his light may have reached before he stepped into the public eye. In traditional Christian accounts, Egypt plays only a minor role in the life of Jesus. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Joseph, warned in a dream, fled with Mary and the infant Jesus to escape Herod's deadly decree. They crossed into Egypt for safety, but then the narrative abruptly moves on. What happened while they were there? How long did they stay? Whom did they encounter? The silence that follows is deafening, but this omission raises essential questions. What did Egypt represent during that era? Why is such a spiritually rich land left almost completely unexplored in connection to the formative years of the greatest spiritual teacher in history? To grasp the potential depth of what Jesus may have encountered in Egypt, one must see beyond the familiar imagery of pyramids and pharaohs. Egypt, for thousands of years, was a sacred landscape, a place where esoteric knowledge flourished. From the wisdom of Thoth to the spiritual disciplines of temple initiates in Karnak and Luxor, Egypt cultivated an understanding of life that merged body, mind, and soul into one harmonious pursuit of divine truth. And towering above this intellectual legacy was one of the ancient world's most astonishing achievements, the Great Library of Alexandria. Established in the 3rd century BCE, this monumental institution did not merely collect Egyptian wisdom. It was a sanctuary for the world's knowledge, housing scrolls and treatises from Greece, India, Persia, Mesopotamia, and even distant China. It was a crucible of ideas, a beacon of enlightenment. Its destruction remains one of the deepest wounds in the history of human thought. Alexandria itself was more than a city, it was a living dialogue. Its streets echoed with debates among Greek philosophers, Jewish scholars, Indian monks, and Egyptian mystics. If Jesus spent even a short time in such an environment, if he walked those corridors of culture as a boy or a young man, it would have profoundly shaped his vision of God, truth, and humanity. Not far from Alexandria, an enigmatic group known as the Therapeutae lived in seclusion. Described by the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, these men and women were devoted to contemplation, healing, fasting, sacred songs, and deep meditation. Their spirituality was experiential, not tied to rigid doctrine, but to inner transformation. They sought purity of heart, balance of the body, and divine connection through silence. And what's astonishing is how closely their practices mirror those later attributed to Jesus. Withdrawal into solitude, fasting as a tool for spiritual clarity, healing through touch and intention, teaching through symbolic stories, building communities centered around love and shared devotion. Who could Jesus have encountered the Therapeutae during his youth? The parallels are too numerous to dismiss as mere coincidence, but Egypt was not only a place of practical wisdom, it was a realm of sacred mystery. In temples such as Heliopolis and Luxor, initiates underwent spiritual rites that symbolized the death of the ego and the rebirth of the soul. These weren't theatrical rituals. They were intense inner transformations, journeys through fear, shadow, and silence to emerge renewed in purpose and identity. One of the most profound archetypes in Egyptian spirituality was Osiris, the god who dies, is dismembered, and returns to life. His myth, passed from mouth to mouth across generations, speaks of the soul's descent into darkness, its fragmentation, and its resurrection through love and wisdom. Is it mere coincidence that Jesus, too, spoke of death and resurrection, not only in a literal sense, but as a pathway for every soul to transcend its brokenness? When Jesus spoke of being born again, of the seed that must die to bear fruit, of losing life to find it, was he echoing the eternal wisdom that once echoed in Egypt's sacred halls? If he did pass through Egypt, not just as a child in exile, but as a student of its hidden truths, then the message he later preached was not diminished. It was enriched, rooted in universal insight, infused with the sacred breath of multiple civilizations. To see Jesus in this way is not to reduce him. It is to behold him more fully, as a bridge between heaven and earth, between cultures, between past and future, as a light not confined to one path, but shining through them all. One of the most enigmatic declarations Jesus ever made was, "Before Abraham was, I am." To many, it's a theological mystery. To others, a cryptic challenge to temporal logic. But for those familiar with ancient Egyptian wisdom, it carries echoes of something even older. In the sacred teachings of Egypt, "I am" was not a phrase of self-reference. It was a divine affirmation. "I am that I am" was a formula used by initiates to describe the eternal consciousness, the unchanging presence that exists at the heart of all creation. It was the language of the soul recognizing its own divine origin. This wasn't an isolated resonance. Jesus' insistence on spiritual rebirth, on dying to the self, and awakening into a higher state of being, mirrors the initiatory teachings found in the Hermetic texts and Egyptian mystery schools. For those ancient priests and mystics, resurrection wasn't a physical return from death. It was the profound rebirth of awareness, a transformation of identity, a rising from ignorance into illumination. The same transformation Jesus described when he spoke of losing one's life to truly find it. That these connections are absent from the canonical Gospels does not mean they never existed. More likely, they were removed or deliberately excluded during the careful construction of the early Christian narrative. A Jesus shaped by Egyptian initiation and exposed to mystical traditions didn't fit the Roman Church's vision of a singular, untouchable Messiah disconnected from all other traditions. They needed a cornerstone for a new religious empire, not a bridge to other sacred paths. There was also symbolic discomfort. For the Jewish people, Egypt represented centuries of bondage and trauma. It was a land tied to slavery, not enlightenment. To associate Jesus too closely with it might have alienated his earliest followers. But what if, for Jesus, Egypt wasn't a place of oppression, but of awakening? Even today, the Coptic communities of Egypt hold ancient oral traditions suggesting that Jesus spent more time there than commonly believed. Some stories speak of caves where he meditated, villages that welcomed him as a wandering sage, and springs where he taught about love and compassion. While archaeology has yet to confirm these legends, the longevity and conviction with which they are held point to something meaningful etched into cultural memory. Some even propose that Mary, the mother of Jesus, received esoteric instruction from Egyptian circles, and that she, not Joseph, was the first to guide her son into sacred knowledge. If true, this reframes everything. Jesus would not be a figure who simply knew, but one who learned. A child shaped by mystery. A seeker before he became a teacher. A student of light before he became its embodiment. To accept Egypt's influence on Jesus is not to diminish his divinity. On the contrary, it reveals a deeper, more human path to transcendence. It shows a man who did not arrive on earth pre-programmed with revelation, but who walked the hard path of study, silence, and inner struggle to arrive at wisdom. A man who drank from ancient wells and poured their truth into a new cup for his generation. He was not a voice isolated in the desert. He was a chorus of sacred traditions, harmonized through one life. A soul who took the fragments of forgotten truths and wove them into a message of love, healing, and liberation. If that's true, then the near-total erasure of his time in Egypt wasn't incidental, it was intentional, a cleansing of inconvenient history to preserve the image of a savior who belonged to only one path. But Jesus was never meant to be confined. He was, and remains, a guide for all seekers, regardless of their tradition. What would our understanding of him look like if those chapters had survived? If we could read about his moments of silence near the Nile, his dialogues with mystics under desert skies, his awakenings beside the ancient temples, we may never know for certain. Yet in the depth of his words, in the wisdom that transcends creed, in the compassion that breaks all borders, Egypt whispers. Not in ruins or scrolls, but between the lines of his teachings. Behind the veil of missing years lies more than absence. It hides the weight of decisions, political power, and theological ambition. Because silence is rarely accidental. It is often designed, and what is left unsaid can be as transformative as what is proclaimed. To understand why parts of Jesus' life were erased from the official narrative, we must look beyond theology, into the heart of history where religion and empire met. The 4th century changed everything. In 313 AD, the Edict of Milan brought a radical shift to the Roman Empire. No longer would Christians face persecution for their beliefs. The underground faith was finally stepping into the light, but not without consequence. Just 12 years later, Emperor Constantine summoned the most powerful bishops of the time to a defining moment in religious history, the Council of Nicaea. This wasn't merely a theological gathering, it was a political strategy. The goal was unambiguous: unity, not just within the church, but across the fragile and fractured empire. Belief systems were to be harmonized, disagreements silenced. And in this drive toward doctrinal clarity, the most profound decision was made: to canonize certain writings and discard the rest. That's how the canonical Gospels were chosen. And how many others, equally ancient, deeply spiritual, and radically different, were buried or burned. Among the excluded texts were Gospels and writings that painted a more complex portrait of Jesus. They included stories of his childhood, his travels beyond Judea, his contact with sages from the East, and teachings centered on meditation, inner divinity, and the transformative power of self-knowledge. These writings didn't deny his greatness, but they humanized it. They presented a Jesus who learned before he taught, who listened before he spoke, who searched before he found. But this was not the Jesus that Rome needed. A Messiah molded by foreign wisdom, influenced by other traditions, and formed through experience, posed a threat to the Church's emerging narrative. How could he be portrayed as the sole, divine Son of God, if his path echoed the journeys of seekers from other lands? How could Christianity assert its absolute authority if its founder shared truths with Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, or the Egyptian mysteries? The answer was decisive: eliminate the ambiguity, discredit the alternatives, establish one version of the truth, and label all others as heresy. And so it was done. With imperial backing, church fathers redefined the story of Jesus. They silenced the diverse voices of early Christian communities. They destroyed texts that challenged the official image. They declared dangerous any interpretation that deviated from the sanctioned view. Over time, a singular theology emerged, tightly controlled, institutionally protected, and politically useful. But the cost was profound. In the rush to unify, a rich spiritual heritage was lost. Windows into Jesus' humanity were closed. Bridges to other cultures and faiths were burned. The church ceased to be a movement of mystical insight and became a structure of authority. What had once been a path of exploration became a map with fixed borders and dire consequences for crossing them. Few today realize that before Nicaea, Christianity was far from uniform. Some believers saw Jesus as a prophet, others as a sage. Some emphasized his divinity, others his profound humanity. There were Christian sects that taught reincarnation, encouraged meditation, and pursued union with God through silence rather than ritual. All of these were suppressed, erased from the mainstream, to build a single, immovable image of Christ. What emerged from that erasure was not a lie, but a simplification, one that stripped away the beautiful tension between the divine and the human, one that abandoned nuance in favor of control. And in doing so, it locked away parts of the truth that might have drawn hearts across cultures and centuries. To embrace the idea that Jesus may have been influenced by other traditions is not to weaken his message, it's to expand it. It reveals a teacher who sought truth wherever it lived, who was shaped by sacred conversations that transcended borders, a traveler, a student, a bridge between worlds. This Jesus, curious, courageous, humble, is not less divine. He is more real, more accessible, a model for the soul's journey through mystery, questioning, and transformation. But institutional religion had no room for such complexity. It needed a Christ fully formed, descending from heaven, complete and untouchable, untouched by time, culture, or tradition. Yet beneath the polished narrative, the echoes of an older, broader story still call out. A story not lost, but waiting for those with the courage to listen. The version of Jesus that emerged from institutional doctrine was one who had no need to learn, because he already knew everything. A figure complete from birth, untouched, unquestioning. This portrayal left no room for gaps, doubts, or sacred mystery, only certainty. And to preserve that certainty, some things had to remain unspoken. But silence is not the absence of truth. Sometimes silence is where the truth waits to be rediscovered. The result of this long silence has been a fractured spirituality. On one side stands a powerful religious institution, holding tightly to ancient dogmas and defined hierarchies. On the other, millions of souls wander in search of something deeper, something that speaks not to authority, but to the heart. The growing dissonance between the historical Jesus and the theological Christ has left many confused, disillusioned, and spiritually orphaned. It's not that they stopped believing, it's that they stopped recognizing the image of Jesus presented to them. And yet, something has shifted. In recent years, scholars, mystics, and open-hearted seekers around the world have begun to piece together the forgotten fragments. They are unearthing lost gospels, re-examining buried traditions, and exploring the universal currents that flow through Jesus' message. This isn't about discarding the past. It's about widening it, not destroying tradition, but deepening it, not rejecting faith, but rescuing it from confinement. The silence around Jesus' missing years was never spiritual, it was political, a choice made to protect power, not to preserve enlightenment. But now, that long-buried truth is rising again, not to erase what we already know, but to complete the picture we've only seen in fragments. To imagine Jesus walking the streets of Alexandria, or meditating in Tibetan temples, or learning beside desert sages, does not diminish his divinity. It amplifies it. It reveals a soul so committed to truth that he was willing to search for it, wherever it could be found. It reveals a man who wove together the wisdom of many cultures into a single radiant message of love. And perhaps that is why his teachings still breathe, because they were never born from exclusivity, but from universality. Because they didn't emerge from isolation, but from integration. His story does not end in silence. In fact, it's in the silence where we begin to hear what was never spoken. As his influence grew and his words threatened the religious structure of his time, Jesus became more than a teacher. He became a threat. Not because he led armies or demanded thrones, but because he proposed something far more revolutionary, that the sacred was not confined to temples or controlled by priests. It lived within each person. This wasn't merely a theological concept. It was a lived practice. Jesus didn't just preach about the kingdom of heaven in lofty terms. He embodied it through his touch, his presence, his breath. He brought that kingdom into reality. He healed, liberated, restored, without complex rituals, without official mediation. His body was a conduit for a living wisdom. The stories of miraculous healings weren't just displays of divine power. They were philosophy in action. He reached for the sick, and they stood. Sometimes he didn't even need to touch them. A single word, a silent gaze, a shared belief. These weren't tricks. They revealed an understanding of consciousness, of spirit, of the intimate relationship between the mind and the body. These acts may seem extraordinary to us, but in the East they sound strangely familiar. In Ayurvedic medicine, the flow of prana, the life force, can be balanced through touch, breath, and intention. In Tibetan healing, mantras and visualizations realign the soul. In Chinese traditions, qi flows through the meridians and is harnessed through stillness and movement. Jesus, knowingly or not, mirrored these principles. The way he placed his hands, the pauses before he acted, the solitude after intense encounters. These are not random details. They are energetic behaviors, the kind practiced by monks, healers, and mystics across Asia for millennia. One moment stands out. The woman who touched the hem of his garment. She didn't ask. She didn't speak. She simply believed. And when she touched him, he turned and said, "I felt power go out from me." What kind of awareness must one possess to feel the invisible transfer of healing energy? What level of spiritual mastery senses the exchange of faith and force? In a crowd, he said, "Someone touched me, for I felt power flow out from me." This statement, more than religious poetry, hints at a deep understanding of energetic transmission, something long recognized in the esoteric traditions of Asia. But where did this knowledge come from? Was it the result of sudden inner illumination? Or was it the fruit of a formative journey, perhaps during those lost years shrouded in silence? What's clear is that Jesus never viewed healing as merely physical. He aimed for wholeness. His compassion toward the outcast, the unclean, and the forgotten reveals a deep awareness of integrated being. To heal meant to restore dignity, rekindle faith, and return a person to their rightful place in the world. His healings weren't displays of divine power, they were acts of embodied wisdom. He reached people not through ritual, but through presence. A word, a touch, a glance. These were enough. Like ancient Eastern healers who worked with prana, qi, or spiritual intention, Jesus understood that healing began from within. This kind of freedom, healing without permission, teaching without hierarchy, made him dangerous. His very life challenged the systems that thrived on fear and control. He invited people to experience the sacred within themselves, to see the body as a temple, the breath as prayer, and silence as sacred space. If his youth was spent learning from Egyptian mystics or Eastern teachers, then his wisdom wasn't miraculous, it was cultivated. And if his greatest legacy wasn't founding a religion, but living a path of embodied truth, then recovering that story is not betrayal, it's remembrance. Perhaps what was erased from his story is what makes ours whole. And maybe what he lived in silence, we are now being called to rediscover in stillness.